Good morning, Carnway Cougars and Jedis. Today we continue reading Small Spaces, Chapter 13. It's starting to get really good, guys. Coco darted into the trees after Ollie. The forest seemed to close around them like bars of a cage. I'm glad Brian didn't come, panted Coco. He's just a lump. Ollie thought of Coco's notebook the day before, the two faces nestled in a perfectly shaped heart, but she didn't say anything. Coco tripped over a root that would have gone sprawling, but Ollie caught her, barely. You pair of idiots, said Brian, marching up behind them. Both girls spun, still clutching to each other. I'm just following you because you're both crazy, he added. Someone has to make sure you don't fall into the creek and die. I'll probably get a medal for it. They'll make me an Eagle Scout. We didn't ask you, said Coco coldly, and then she tripped again. Brian snorted. Only because you're complete idiots. At least City Girl here has an excuse. But you, Ollie? I'm nuts, remember, said Ollie. Everyone says so. She quickened her pace. Some blind instinct lifted the hairs on her arms and urged her on. Coco seemed to feel it too, for she hurried along right behind. Brian muttered, "Geez, I can't believe I'm doing this," and then followed. The path was narrow and winding and ribbed with roots. Coco, less used to moving outdoors, kept tripping. The third time Coco lurched forward and nearly sent Ollie to the ground, she snapped, "Could you not?" "Sorry," Coco said, wilting. "Well, at least we won't get too far from the bus before one of you breaks your ankle," Brian said. Ollie ignored him. "Why do you have to be so mean?" Coco demanded of Brian. "Mean? Are you talking about the part where I saved your lives because you ran off into a strange forest after dark?" Brian snapped back. Coco ground her teeth. "You're just full of yourself." Brian had his mouth open to retort, but Ollie said, "Shut up, both of you. Either I've lost it or something's wrong. Honestly, I hope I'm crazy, but if I'm not, could we not let the entire forest know that we're here?" Brian rolled his eyes but stopped talking. Coco felt instantly quiet and tiptoed along Ollie's wake. Ollie supposed they were trying to be quiet, but Coco made a lot of noise snapping sticks, and even Brian wasn't quiet as Ollie, who'd spent years mushrooming with her mother in all kinds of terrain and weather. It'd be hard to hide with this crew. Ollie wished her mom were there. She glanced at her watch with its flickering warning, 15 minutes and 56 seconds. How did her watch know? The trees rattled overhead, masking the sound of their footsteps. The cold leaves were slimy underfoot. Coco tripped again and caught Ollie's backpack to keep herself from falling. Ollie windmilled her arms, barely keeping her own balance, and she glared at Coco. "Sorry," Coco mouthed. Brian walked behind them grumbly. "You don't even know where you're going," he said, although he didn't talk as loud as before. "Ollie does," snapped Coco. "We had to leave the bus," Ollie said. "Remember what the bus driver said. At nightfall, they will come for the rest of you." "I was wrong," said Brian. "You're not going to get in trouble. You're too crazy to get in trouble. Plead insanity at the hearing. That should clear things right up." "I hope we get in trouble," said Ollie grimly. "I really hope so, because that would mean I'm wrong." Brian said nothing. Cold skeleton trees clustered thick on either side. The path itself twisted and turned, going gradually downhill. There was no proper sunset, just a slow, inedible darkness. Eventually had to pull out their phones to see. Their flashlight apps lit the woods in pieces and made everything seem sinister and unreal. Also, Ollie thought nervously with lights in the dark forest that they might as well have been shouting, "We're here!" to anyone who would care to look. They came to a place where the trail disappeared, and Ollie halted, uncertain. "Where are we?" Coco whispered. Her voice sounded loud in the stillness. "It's like it's not even October anymore." Coco was right. In Evansburg, the trees were bright with golden leaves. Here in the trees were bare, the wind sharp. Brown leaves lay thick underfoot. "The rain last night just knocked the leaves down," said Brian. "All of them?" retorted Coco. Ollie didn't say anything. She was struggling to find the path, even with their phone lights. "I think it's this way," she said, and she headed off again. Coco was sticking close to Ollie, huffing and puffing and still cracking sticks under her feet. "The way to what?" demanded Brian, following them, exasperated. Ollie wished again that her mother were here. The shadows were drooping faster and faster, like the net descending. "Where are we going? Where are we going? What are we doing?" said Brian, echoing her thoughts. "Ollie, are you done being nuts yet?" Her watch chimed gently against her wrist. Ollie looked down and in startled reflex, nearly tripping on a protruding root. The display had changed to hide, it said. The display lit up for an instant with a flickering blue glow. Ollie was paralyzed for a second. The countdown said 8 minutes. I'm scared, whispered Coco. They hurried down the path now, not talking. The leaves crunched under their feet. The trees groaned over their heads. Where's the farm? Asked Coco. We should have found it by now, right? Are we lost? Hide. It's getting dark, said Coco. That tends to happen at night, Brian muttered. And then, who's that? He asked suddenly, pointing. Is that? It looked like a person standing with his back to them. Hey, said Brian, hurrying over. Hey, mister. Brian, wait, began Ollie. Too late. Brian put his hand on the man's shoulder and then yelped and jumped back. The arm flopped and the head fell sideways. It wasn't a person at all. Only a scarecrow. The blank face scowled at them, hazy in the gathering dark. I thought it was a person, whispered Brian. Well, said Ollie, trying to be reasonable to ignore her rising panic, a scarecrow means we must be near the farm. Coco screamed. Brian and Ollie spun. Coco stood with her hands over her mouth, pointing at the tree trunks. We see you, was written on the tree, overhead in a ragged, dripping white letters. Below them, another scarecrow leaned against the tree. There was paint on his coveralls, and he was grinning ear to ear. He had no hands at all, just 2 flopping paintbrushes, where his hands should be. All 3 stared at the letters for a moment, disbelieving. What is that? Demanded Brian. Some kind of weird joke? Halloween? Look, gasped Coco, pointing. Ollie followed her finger. The first scarecrow was gone. I'm scared, whispered Coco. I'm really scared. Coco, hush, said Ollie. Be still. It wasn't me, Coco replied, a pause. And then she said in a trembling voice, we should have stayed on the bus. She was turning in circles like a scared puppy. Which way? I can't remember. Which way to the bus? Duh, said Brian. His voice was thin with fright. That's what I was trying to tell you. We should have stayed on the bus. That's what they tell you to do when you're lost. Stay in one place until they come to help you. Ollie wondered if Brian was right. Better on the bus than alone in the forest with another stick cracked somewhere out in the darkness. Then another, louder, closer. Their phone lights were flickering now, just like the bus lights, just like Ollie's watch. We can't go back now, said Ollie. We have to hide. Coco and Brian hesitated. It'll be warmer that way, Ollie improvised. Her hands began to shake. It's getting colder. It was. The wind was cold as dead fingers creeping through their sweaters and rain jackets. Come on, she said. On they went, stumbling through the woods. Out in the forest came a steady crackling of sticks. Who's doing that? Asked Brian, breathless and frightened. If one of you set this up, Coco shrieked. What? Cried Ollie. Eyes, Coco whispered. I thought I saw eyes shining. Just an animal, said Brian. Ollie didn't say anything. The spatters of rain had become occasional snowflakes, cold on her tongue and fingers. Look, she said, stopping. 2 rocks sat leaning against together. The little triangle shape between them, like jack-o'-lantern's eye. Let's hide in there, said Ollie. Unenthusiastic silence. It's too small, said Brian at last. There might be anything in there. A snake? A skunk? We have to hide, said Ollie. We have to hide now. 2 minutes and 12 seconds, said her watch. Overhead, bare branches groaned. Ollie shone her dim phone screen into the triangle made by the leaning rocks. Damp, dark, empty. Come on! Brian and Coco didn't move. Beneath them came a shrill wee, faint but clear through the trees. It sounded like an alarm. What is that? Coco whispered. Her fair hair stuck to her cheeks. She was sweating in spite of the cold. Brian had gone still. The alarm at the back of the bus, he said. What? Demanded Ollie. Microfilm must have opened the back door. Those idiots, said Brian. Even in the weak light from their phones, Ollie could see that Brian didn't quite believe what he was saying. There's an alarm on the buses that goes off if the back door is open. But, breathed Coco, what if it wasn't them? A scream tore through the twilight, then a whole chorus of screaming. A bus full of kids. They stared at each other. The screams got louder. Oh, what is it? Cried Coco. What? Ollie's watch beeped again, and it was glowing, a faint blue. The countdown stood 0. Behind them was a chink, as if metal dragged along wood. Ollie thought she saw a pale patch, like a face glimpsed between the trees, then lost. Chink. But no, it couldn't be. It just couldn't. Coco was breathing like someone trying not to scream. I saw something moving. I saw it just there. Crunch went the footsteps. There, cried Brian. I saw a face. It could be someone nice, said Coco, but her voice was trembling. It's not, said Coco. A nice person would call out or something. She thought of the scarecrows with the troweled hands it thought was enough to send her to her knees, scrabbling for the cleft between the rocks. She dove forward, found herself in surprisingly a roomy crawl space, and turned. Up above, Coco did scream. Brian shouted. Coco, Ollie cried. Brian! A hulking thing had come up from behind them, walking on limbs that were too long and jointed in weird places. A hand, a rake hand, gleamed in their shaking phone lights. Come on, Ollie bellowed, backing up. Coco hurtled into the cage, bowling over Ollie. All of them, Brian screamed. Above them, Brian screamed. Coco flipped around at once and scrabbled back into the cave entrance. Brian! Ollie had an impossible glimpse of Brian laying on the ground while the black-suited scarecrow bent down towards him, a rake hand reaching as though it meant to hook itself under Brian's collar and drag him away. There were small stones in the mouth of the cave, gritty under Ollie's hands. She groped for one. The stone bounced with a ping off the rake, and the sound was enough to jar Brian out of his shock. Come on, Brian, come on! Cried Coco. Brian began crawling under the rocks. Ollie let another stone fly and hit the scarecrow right below the eye. A nightmare face turned to Ollie, stitched on a snarl. Eyes like 2 finger-sized holes. The rake reached out again. With a desperate heave, Brian got himself into the cave and they all scrambled towards the back, panting. A huge straw-smelling arm thrust itself into the hole. Coco's breath sounded more like a sob. The 3 of them pressed themselves against the back of the rock. The arm groped, almost touching Ollie's ankle. She pulled it beneath herself. Her heartbeat shook like a rabbit in an open field. Then the arm withdrew. The rustling footsteps faded. A silence fell. After a moment, Coco and Ollie and Brian turned to look at each other. What? Said Coco. What was that? Brian began to giggle, and then he began to laugh. What? Snapped Ollie, still out of breath with fright. Is so funny. Alice in Wonderland, said Brian. Remember? How do you know I'm mad? Asked Alice. You must be, Ollie said, finishing the quotation slowly, or you wouldn't have come here. Brian buried his face in his hands. All right, Conway Cougars and Jedis especially. That was the end of chapter 13. Tune in tomorrow to see what happens in chapter 14. Have a good day.